Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Michael, the tech editor of the Irish and Sunday Independent. This week we're talking about Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and Elon Musk and space tourism and what the heck is the point to the whole thing. I'm joined by Professor Louis Brennan, who's Professor of Business Studies at Trinity College Dublin. He wrote a very interesting piece about this in the conversation, Louis, which I really enjoyed. But just before we get into the specifics of that, what's the point of space tours? I'm trying to get my head around it. What's the point to it all?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and it's a question that's not without its controversies. The whole purpose of space tourism. I suppose if we step back and we look at the journey of humanity through the centuries and through the ages, human race has always been a pioneering race. It's always been exploring. It's always been aiming for the next frontier and so on. So that sense of adventure, that pioneering spirit, is very much, a driver of space tourism and giving people the opportunity to engage in the next big thing, as it were. If we go back.
Are you being generous here? Because I do take the point, and there's definitely is another side to this which we can explore, which is humanity looking to the stars and looking to maybe colonize other planets for the purpose of surviving and not going extinct. There's another motive, which is that you happen to have, $20 billion and you're only going to live for another 11 years and you want to spend 55 million of it visiting the International Space Station, or 28 million of it taking a ride with Jeff Bezos. And it's not even really space, is it? Because it's 50 miles up or 60 miles up. I mean, yes, you're weightless, but you can see the curve of the Earth, but it's not exactly Star Trek.
No, I mean it's not that you're soaring into the heavens way beyond through the galaxy and into other galaxies, by no means. But I think you have to remember that we're very much in the beginning stages of this adventure into space. I mean, if you go back in time, like if you go back to the start of space exploration, you had two major actors at that stage, which were the two superpowers, the United States and the then Soviet Union. And you fast forward to today, and what you have is some 70 countries worldwide that are involved in various ways, including Ireland, in space-related activity. But in addition, then, and this is where Bezos and Branson and Musk come in, is you've seen a movement over the past decade and more towards the involvement of the private sector in space and towards the involvement of what I call super empowered individuals. These are super wealthy individuals. I mean, after all, Bezos is the wealthiest individual in the world.
Not anymore. Not anymore. This week, I believe, unless I'm wrong, I think Bernard Arnault overtook him slightly by a few dozen $1 million or something paltry like that.
Yeah, well, I believe that when Bezos went into space there 2 weeks ago, he was actually the richest man in the world at that stage. Yeah, yes. Yeah. So there's no question that, coming back to your question, that there is, of course, a huge ego element in all of this, particularly for these, super wealthy individuals. I mean, the phrase "boys with toys," wealthy boys with toys, has been thrown around to characterize their activity in relation to space. And beyond that, of course, there's a really good argument that has been raised by many people, which is these people have so much money. Isn't there so much more they could be doing with their money other than spending it on space exploration and space adventures? Well, I suppose if you step back and look at the history of space and look at what space has done for planet Earth and the population and the people of planet Earth, then maybe you would think again, because there is so much today that we have in terms of capabilities on planet Earth, in terms of the ability to communicate, in terms of navigation ability, in terms of monitoring ability, in terms of weather forecasting, in terms of getting to understand the environment, in terms of forestry, agriculture, and so on, that we wouldn't have except for the exploration of space, because space drove the development of a huge plethora of technologies. And if you think in terms of many of the things that we take for granted today, like, for example, your mobile phone, we wouldn't have all that functionality in our mobile phones today without space. So space has brought benefits back here on planet Earth. And so the argument would be that if you think space is just a frivolous activity, you can certainly take that view. But I mean, the history of space exploration would say that it has brought benefits back here to planet Earth, to our ability to operate. It has enabled many inventions and many innovations. You think in terms of healthcare, you think in terms of all the healthcare equipment that developments that were driven by advanced into space produced. So there are benefits there. Now, that's not to say that, there aren't environmental costs in going into space as well. But
yeah, I think I read somewhere that for Elon Musk's SpaceX rocket, the Falcon 9, I think to use it once, it burns as much fuel as an average car would over 200 years, something like that. I think I'd agree with you. I defend Musk and Bezos, certainly, and they have outlined clear ideology, and they seem to be believers in the idea of using space and exploring space for the survival of our species. I believe them when they say that. Branson, on the other hand, that just looks like a gig. It looks to me a little bit like he's doing it like he launched Virgin Records or Virgin whatever. Let's launch Virgin, Galactic, kind of for the crack.
Yeah, well, of course, ultimately, I mean, Branson stands apart from Bezos and to a certain extent from Musk as well, in that Branson is your classic showman. I mean, he's a quintessential marketeer, and
he's also a Poundland billionaire compared to the other. He's worth, I don't know, 2 or 3 billion compared to the 40, 60, 100 billion of the others.
But coming back to your point then in terms of the survival of the species, I mean, there's a real argument here in terms of, if you look at the state of planet Earth at the moment, and there would be a view among some that we're in a state of irreversible catastrophe on planet Earth with what's happening in terms of the climate and the climate emergency and so on. Will we arrive at a point in the future in which living on planet Earth becomes physically impossible? And will it be necessary then to think in terms of extraterrestrial living and being? And
it's interesting it's interesting you raise that point, because it's not directly what we're talking about today, but I was reading about the potential planets that we could colonize at some point. Mars is usually the one given in our own solar system. And despite Elon Musk saying that he thinks we'll be able to start the journey to colonize Mars in 6 years' time, he's always come up with these ridiculously near deadlines. Most scientists say that relative to Earth, even the worst projections of the Earth at the moment, Mars is still very difficult. One described it as a hellhole, 38% of the gravity. We're not sure how much water is there. It would take a lot of advancement for us to be able to do that. And then, of course, the other argument that some make is, well, if we are messing Earth up at the moment, shouldn't we just stop messing it up?
Yeah, in fact, that's often been said to me when I advance the argument around, space being the final destination of the survival of the species, that, hey, haven't we done enough damage on planet Earth besides...
We don't want to wreck the rest of it, exactly, the cosmos.
Yes.
I absolutely. Just to go back to a few of the details of the launches that we have seen and that are upcoming, it's expensive, isn't it, to be one of these space?
Oh, it's very expensive. I mean, journeying into space is not cheap. I mean, if you think in terms of the 600 or so people who booked flights on Branson's Virgin Galactic, they've paid in the region of $200,000 to $250,000 for a flight.
I think Bill Cullen was one of those, wasn't he? I think Bill Cullen of Renault, he posted at the time.
Yes.
I'm not sure if he still has his ticket or whether it's transferable.
Yeah. And then if you think in terms of Blue Origin's Bezos flight into space there a few weeks ago was distinctive in the sense that it carried the first fee-paying passenger into space. And the original, that fee-paying passenger was originally selected via an auction. They bid it in an auction, and the winning bid was $28 million. That's high, but in general, you're talking about a cost which is prohibitive for the ordinary person, and you're talking in terms of space tourism for now, and in the short to medium term, being a very niche market for high net worth individuals.
Yeah, what is it that guy who paid 28 million for that seat can come back and boast to his mates at the country club at the weekend? Because he can say that he was the first or one of the first people to pay to go into space. But other than that, what does he actually say? Oh, you should have seen it, Larry. This curvature of the Earth, it was amazing. It curved at the edge. You should have been there. Well, for $28 million, it would really want to be pretty special.
Yeah, it certainly would. But it's often said by, astronauts over the decades that when you see Earth from space, it's almost like a life-transforming experience, that you gain a whole new perspective on Earth, on the place where we live and inhabit, and that there is that transformational nature to it.
Some people just go down to the corner and take drugs, Louis. But I take your point. I'm not trying to belittle the point. I would say that it is a life-changing experience.
The other thing that's mentioned is, of course, that you experience weightlessness, which again is a phenomenon. But no, there is certainly that kind of edge in terms of, well, I've been to space, I've one up on you. So on my other multi-millionaire buddies, I've now got a step ahead of you. There is definitely that one-upmanship about it,
Yeah, I've got the best watch. I've got the first edition new Ferrari, all those things. For Virgin Galactic, it hasn't been an entirely smooth ride to this point, of course. We must
absolutely not, because remember that Virgin Galactic was established back in the early part of the century, I think in 2004. And you mentioned earlier about Elon Musk and his optimistic projections and forecasts for going to Mars and so forth. Well, in fact, all of these breed of space billionaires, optimism tends to be a driver of their activities. And Virgin Galactic and Branson had promised many, many times that years ago, he would be operating a regular space tourism enterprise. In fact, the people that I mentioned that paid up to $250,000 to book their flights, they originally booked their flights back in the latter part of the noughties, in fact.
But I think there have been fatalities as well, haven't there?
And there have been fatalities. I mean, the ship, the spacecraft that took Branson and the three Galactic employees to space on July the 11th, the predecessor of that craft actually crashed, and one of the pilots was actually killed. And there was an earlier incident then at the original spaceport that they were operating in, where there was an explosion and a number of people were killed as well. So there's been a lot of false dawns, a lot of false starts, a lot of promises made by Virgin Galactic and Branson. But space is not a straightforward undertaking. It's very complicated. It's very complex. It's very risky. Lots of things can go wrong. But I think in fairness to Branson and Virgin Galactic, they're now at a point where shortly they will be starting their space tourism flights on at least a semi-regular basis.
Well, I hope they can keep the fatality rate lower than the industry average, because I was looking at NASA's figures. Now, you can't really compare like with like, but NASA's own figures in terms of statistical fatalities associated to its space flights is 3.2%, which means that 1 in every 30 odd people is going to die, en route. Now,
which is huge compared to taking a ship in a car or even in a single aircraft.
Especially when you're talking about the profile of people rich enough to afford this, they are most likely to be, let's be honest, older, elderly, or getting on. They're not in their physical prime. They might have heart issues. They might have other issues. Now, it's it's a little trivial to compare the 3% of NASA to what's going to happen here, because it's an entirely different thing. It was much earlier time, and they're not going as far with Branson or any of these. But even still, the element of danger is there. I mean, I've done other podcasts, for example, on the number of satellites that are in orbit, and Elon Musk's SpaceX, his Starlink, he's launching thousands of satellites. Right. Lots of companies are. There's actually going to be a real issue of trying to dodge satellites when you launch.
That's right. I mean, you mentioned Musk's space constellation, the Starlink. I mean, you're going to run the real danger that they're going to have congestion in space. But beyond that, then, and perhaps an even bigger issue is the proliferation of space junk, where you have satellites and space vehicles, coming to the end of their life, and then disintegrating and floating around in space, and perhaps causing collisions. So this is actually an issue which is garnering a lot of attention at the moment, and I suppose it points to the fact that space is the next frontier, and as a frontier, as of yet, it's not regulated or organized as, let's say, many of the activities on planet Earth is. So there's the, if you like, as often happens in terms of futuristic activities, the pace of development of these future activities outpaces the development of a regulatory and safety structure and legal structure governing the whole activity. And your point about space congestion, and indeed the proliferation of space junk, is a very real one that needs timely action.
Yeah, one of those regulatory conditions I was reading, you correct me if I'm wrong, is that among the things you don't have to have is a pressurized spacesuit. I know that Branson and Virgin Galactic want to develop this short sleeve model where you don't have to look like a 1950s Russian cosmonaut to go into space. But some of the scientific opinions I was reading was saying that at the moment, with our current level of technology, that may not be a good thing. On the other hand, and you pointed out this in your article in the conversation, you said that there are already tangible benefits in terms that are ahead of the regulatory schedule, in terms of, for example, the technology, reusable rockets, in terms of advances in how funding is coming into the sector, right?
Yeah. I mean, we maybe have been a bit harsh on these space billionaires so far, but
I think they can hack it.
I think they're well able for it. Their egos are sufficient to withstand it. But in fairness to them, I mean, they have made significant advances, and the prime illustration of that is both in terms of Blue Origin and in terms of SpaceX, their mastery of reusability, that they can now, reuse, bring rockets back to Earth and reuse them multiple times. And that has had the effect of reducing the cost. I mean, the most expensive part of getting into space is that initial blast off and launch off into space. That's been an expensive proposition for decades, but Blue Origin and SpaceX have managed to reduce those costs through their innovations and inventions associated with the reusability of the rockets and craft. And that has been a really formidable advance. So likewise, for example, in the case of Branson's Virgin Galactic and his flights, suborbital flights, they'd also be carrying space experiments which maybe in the past you had to go to the International Space Station to carry out, and that's expensive and it's complex. Whereas there's space experimentation, science experimentation that can be conducted in these craft, whether it's Blue Origin or whether it's Virgin Galactic, which will be less complex and much less expensive to execute.
I've often wondered, not often, but I've occasionally wondered if I was offered a free ticket on one of these flights, either up 50, 60 miles up, or even to the International Space Stations. I think that's happening next year. I think there is a flight, and a couple of people have paid $55 million to go.
That's right.
Would I take that seat? And I'm still not sure that adventure side of me says this is literally a once in a lifetime opportunity. You would literally experience and see things that almost nobody else in the world would. And then the other part of me says, do you know what? You're going to vomit. There's about a 1% chance you'll die. You may not remember much of it. And will it all be worth it? And I still can't figure out which part of me would actually overcome the other. What about you? If you were offered a free ticket, do you think you'd go?
I think I would actually, yes. Yeah. And I mean, in terms of the options that you mentioned, I've always thought that going on Virgin Galactic maybe is the easier option, in the sense that it doesn't require, if you're going to the International Space Station, you're going to have to commit to a long stretch of training and preparation. Whereas if you go on, let's say, Virgin Galactic's flight, you only have a couple of days of preparation and training involved. And there is something, to my way of thinking and observation, there's something particularly graceful and elegant about the Virgin Galactic technology. To see the spacecraft, being carried up into space by the mothership, and then being released, and then being launched, and then blasting in upwards, and then gliding down and landing in the same place where you took off from. There's something attractive to me about that. I mean, there's an elegance or something about it that appeals to me.
Okay.
Whereas sitting, at the top of a massive rocket, as in the case of Blue Origin, and blasting into space and so on, and coming down via parachutes, perhaps on land, perhaps into the ocean, just feels a little bit less attractive to me.
Yeah, it's a little grittier, a little bit more, more reality. Finally, what do you think the end game is here? What do you think we're seeing the start of, and where do you think we'll be in 10, 30, and 50 years?
Yeah. Okay. I think it's very useful that you've taken those different time periods, because I think in the short to medium term, space tourism is going to be largely very much a niche activity. It's going to be for well-endowed individuals, high net worth individuals. I mean, there are various projections for the size of the space tourism industry to the end of this decade, with various projections ranging from $2.5 billion to $5 billion. But I think more interestingly is to look beyond the short to medium term to the long term. And here I draw a comparison between the development and growth of civil aviation and space activity and space travel and space tourism. If you think in terms of civil aviation, for decades, it was the preserve of the well-heeled classes. And it only became a mass tourism, a mass activity, a mass market activity in recent decades, with the lowering of prices and the emergence of low-cost carriers. I would anticipate that into the long term, you would see a similar pattern of development of space tourism. One other thing then I think that we can't exclude here from consideration, and it's quite important in terms of developments here on Earth, is just in the same way as you saw airports develop as huge commercial entities and huge commercial operations, driving development, creating employment, generating economic activity, and so on. In the same way, I think you're going to see spaceports develop over time. And these in turn will become major centers of commercial activity, driving economic development, and so on.
Do you have any gut theory or feeling at all about what that commercial activity will be? Because the parallel between space flight and flight here on Earth stops short on one key metric, and that is that when in the 40s and 50s and 60s people were getting on planes, they were going to another country, often not just for tourism, but often to do business or to meet somebody. This doesn't have that end goal function. This is just going up into space for the sake of it.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, you'll have the host of ancillary services, the flight crews, the maintenance crews, and so on. So there will be activity around that. In addition, then, if people are coming to take off from these spaceports, you're going to have a need for hotels and hospitality and so on.
Absolutely. You could definitely see all of that. And the idea, I'm sure we'll be given grants for, and all the rest of it. And there'll be a race. I'm just coming back full circle to the first question I asked, I suppose, in this podcast. And that is, what is the point? I can definitely see the point of saving our species with an end goal of, say, colonizing another planet or getting minerals or something valuable from other areas in space to bring back to Earth, or maybe trying to experiment on medicines or physics experiments in space. But right now, it doesn't seem apparent to me. It is to Elon Musk. He wants to colonize Mars and other planets. It's not apparent to me what the goal is of a spaceport at this point.
Yeah, well, if you take Spaceport America, which is Branson's new spaceport in New Mexico, which was funded very generously and very lavishly by the state of New Mexico. The hope on the part of the New Mexico state is that, as I was saying earlier, is that it's going to become a hub of activity, of economic activity, and it will drive economic development and so on. In other words, it will have this, agglomeration effect on the region.
So if something is going to happen, let it happen in our area and employ our people.
Exactly.
And they use our services. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, listen, Professor Louis Brennan, it's been a very entertaining 25 minutes chatting to you about this. Louis Brennan, Professor of Business Studies at Trinity College Dublin. And that is all we have time for this week. So from me, Adrian Weckler, the tech editor of the Irish and Sunday Independent, I will talk to you at the same time next week. Bye-bye.